Have you ever had a hard time wrapping your brain around a new idea? You just keep racking your brain but get nowhere. Then someone comes along with a completely different background and a different education, and to them, it's a no-brainer. You can see that they understand it so much better than you do, but you have no clue how they got there. So, you wish you could just pick their brain. Okay, so I just used 4 brain-related idioms. Wrap your brain around something, rack your brain, no-brainer, and pick someone's brain. All of these idioms presuppose an understanding of the brain that attributes to it cognition. In other words, it assumes that the brain is what does the thinking. But the functions of the brain haven't always been understood. For example, ancient Egyptians removed the brain in the process of mummification, regarding it as unessential. And Aristotle thought it was just for cooling the blood. But the role of the brain as the organ of thought is much less recognized even today than you might suppose. Sure, pretty much everyone acknowledges that the brain is the organ most closely associated with thinking, but a whole lot of people, even the vast majority, still think the actual source of thought is something else. At a minimum, they have inconsistent thinking on the issue. Everyone who has a dualistic understanding of human nature, which is most people, ultimately place consciousness and thought beyond the brain. To analyze your own thinking on the matter, consider this. Do you think it's possible to experience any kind of existence without a body? If so, whatever you would include in that existence, perhaps thoughts, feelings, awareness, etc., are things you must be thinking of as ultimately independent of the brain. Another way to reveal your own thinking on this is to imagine someone physically just like every other human. They have all their bodily organs in functioning order, including the brain. However, they have no soul, no spirit, nothing beyond the matter that makes them up. They are an exclusively physical organism. If you think an entity like this would have no self-awareness, no inner mental life, then it shows that you're attributing mental activity not to a brain, but to a soul or spirit. And tons of people think this. I've heard sermons preached against the idea that brains think and have conscious experiences. And even among philosophers and other educated people, you can find those who deny that the brain really thinks. They might say that the brain is the organ through which the non-physical thinking agent controls the body, but ultimately, they say the thinking and conscious experience is beyond the body. So, what did ancient Israelites think? Well, they didn't think that we think with our brains. At least as far as surviving evidence goes, they seem to have had no understanding whatsoever of the functioning of the brain. In fact, there isn't even a word for brain in ancient Hebrew. Some might be tempted to ridicule them over this and regard them as just primitive barbarians, but really, the function of the brain simply was not yet known when Hebrew authors started writing, not by anybody, so far as we know. Plus, it's good to remember that we ourselves are probably ignorant of a whole lot right now that people 3,000 years from now will think of as basic knowledge. Okay, so ancient Israelites didn't attribute thinking to the brain. But it's even more important to recognize that they also didn't attribute thoughts, feelings, and self-awareness to a soul or a spirit or anything at all like a non-physical essence. As we've seen in the past couple episodes, they weren't dualists. They had a materialistic view of human nature. So what we're going to cover right now is the fact that this materialistic view of human nature is also manifest in the fact that they attributed different mental activities to various bodily organs, particularly the kidneys, the liver, and the heart. This is often obscured in translation since the words for kidneys and liver are simply not translated as kidneys and liver when mental activity is attributed to them, but are instead translated as mind or conscience or something else more open to spiritualistic interpretations. But the fact is, we know from ancient Israelite sacrificial texts that these words really do mean liver and kidneys. If you want to look into that, a good starting place is Exodus 29, verse 13. You can just do a word study on the words found there for liver and kidneys. The Hebrew word for heart is usually translated as heart, but people very often mistakenly interpret these heart texts as though they were using the heart as a metaphor for emotions and deep feelings like we do today. But the fact that the heart is spoken of alongside the liver and kidneys as being responsible for cognitive abilities shows that they really were referring to the actual organ, the literal heart. Furthermore, they attribute to the heart things that really don't match our modern metaphorical usage. I'll give examples that illustrate that in a bit, but first let's look at a few references that deal with the kidneys. Psalm 16 verse 7 says, "I bless you, Yahweh, who have counseled me. Also, in the nights my kidneys have corrected me." Notice, the author of the psalm understands the kidneys as correcting him. This clearly attributes to the kidneys thought and conviction and a sense of right and wrong. And this is actually quite typical of the functions attributed to kidneys in ancient Hebrew texts. They were viewed as capable of moral reasoning. Consider these two texts from Jeremiah. First, Jeremiah 17 verse 10. "I, Yahweh, am examining heart and testing kidneys, to give to a man according to his way, and according to the fruit of his works." The next one is from Jeremiah 20, verse 12. "And Yahweh of armies tests a right doer, seeing kidneys and heart." Both of these texts speak of kidneys in the context of testing the moral worth of people's thoughts and actions. You probably noticed the heart was also mentioned. For now, just note that it must be referring to the literal heart since it's mentioned alongside the kidneys. But we'll get to the function of the heart in a minute. There are other texts on kidneys, but for sake of time, we'll have to move on to the liver. I'll read 3 verses in a row. Just listen carefully and pay attention to what the texts attribute to the liver. Psalm 16, verse 9. "Thus my heart gladdened, and my liver rejoiced, and my flesh was dwelling in confidence." Next is Psalm 30, verses 12 and 13. "You have turned my wailing into dancing. For me you opened my sackcloth, and you girded me with gladness, so that my liver would make music for you, and not be still. Yahweh, my deities, for ineffable time I will give you thanks." And lastly, we have Psalm 57, verse 8. "Awake, my liver, awake, bass lyre and lyre. Let me wake up at dawn." By the way, in case you're not familiar with it, the bass lyre and the lyre are 2 stringed instruments that were pretty common in ancient Israel. Okay, so the first verse describes the liver as rejoicing, and the other 2 describe it as making music. Clearly, this attributes to the liver emotional capacity, at least joyful emotion, and also the capacity for creativity, at least in the domain of music. Let's now go to the heart. There are more references to the heart than to the liver and kidneys, so there are tons of examples that could be given, but here are a few to illustrate the point. And remember, while hearing these texts, you'll probably be tempted to interpret them according to our modern metaphor of the heart, but that simply isn't what the ancient writers meant, as will be apparent in at least some of the verses. Okay, first is Genesis 6, verse 5. "And Yahweh saw that the evil of the humans had increased in the land, and every form of the thoughts of their heart was only bad all the day. The key phrase here is thoughts of their heart. This is just the first among many references that attribute cognition to the heart. The next verse is Genesis 17:17. And Abraham fell on his face and laughed. And he said in his heart, to a son of 100 years can one be born? Or can Sarah, a daughter of 90 years, give birth? Notice that this text says that Abraham thought this in his heart. This attributes to the heart linguistic thinking. While today we understand that we form sentences using our brain, ancient Israelites thought that we form sentences using our heart. Again, the literal organ, not our feelings or emotions. Okay, the next verse is Proverbs 15, verse 7. The lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of fools not so. To rebuke someone for their heart not dispersing knowledge implies that hearts should disperse knowledge, which of course entails hearts having the capacity for knowledge. A somewhat more specific instance of the heart having knowledge is found in our next example. This is Exodus 28, verse 3. And you must speak to all who are wise of heart, who I have filled with a breath of wisdom, and they will do the garments of Aaron, to consecrate him to do priestly work for me. Here, to be wise of heart is to have knowledge and skill in garment production. I hope you can see how this simply isn't the modern metaphorical usage of heart. Instead, the heart is here the organ of knowledge and of the sort of cognitive function necessary for technical skills. And finally, we have Proverbs 16, verse 9. The heart of a human will think about his way, and Yahweh will establish his steps. Okay, so the heart thinks, the liver rejoices and creates music, and the kidneys engage in moral reasoning and self-correction. While modern science has established that these organs do not in fact do these things, and that these functions are instead performed by the brain, it's clear that these ancient Hebrew authors had a materialistic understanding of mental activity. Now, this raises a question of what happens when these organs stop functioning. What happens when the body dies? But for that, you'll have to wait for our next episode.